I have always been a casual lore scholar in Destiny 2, but today I came across the Necrotic Grip lore tab, and something about it pierced my soul. It is perhaps the most disturbing lore tab I think I've ever read in this game, speaking of tests, murder, corruption, insanity, and betrayal. There is much more to this tab than meets the ear, and you would be surprised to learn that this lore tab isn't about the gloves at all. Allow me to read you the lore, and then we will discuss a full breakdown, as well as my chronological interpretation of the story here. Project Day 2. I just got my first look at artifact H-349. It's heavier than expected. More than a few people questioned if we should even study something with such a dire legacy, but if we can't understand our enemy's tools, then we leave ourselves vulnerable to them. Project Day 5. Ran our first test of the artifact's, let's call them necrotic properties. We used cattle. They were large enough to survive the initial discharge. The results have been upsetting. No more animal testing. Project Day 30. Spectral analysis is back, and it's got nothing. The artifact doesn't operate like traditional hive tech, which is our closest analog. A cult of deranged fanatics can mass-produce knockoffs, but we can't even tell you what it's made from. Project Day 31. We had an accidental discharge. Caro, lab tech over in 4B. Human, so this is going to be it for him. We've got someone staying with him as the corruption spreads. At the very least, there's so much more to study now as we watch his unfortunate deterioration. He's been babbling since it hit his central nervous system, saying, "I'm reborn," or variations thereof. I think he sounds almost happy. Project Day 39. The Vanguard forbade a post-mortem, but a few of us couldn't stomach the idea of Caro's sacrifice being in vain. The results have been insightful. Off the record, I'm keeping a few tissue samples. It almost feels like having him around again. Project Day 41. We began the day with another moment of silence for our lost colleague. It's too bad he's not around to appreciate it. Project Day 45. We kept thinking about H-349 as a destroyer, but it's more sophisticated than that. I mean, with a normal gun, it's just, boom, done. H-349, on the other hand, is deadly, not destructive. Much like a viper, its bite does not bring about instant death. Instead, its venom cajoles. It co-opts your beating heart into a death clock, ticking down your last moments. Your own pulse kills you. Death may be slow and agonizing for its victim, but for the viper, time is an amenable trade for efficiency. Project Day 51. Yaniv has been crying a lot lately. We must accept that tragedies happen. It's a hard lesson to learn. Project Day 65. Another accidental discharge today. We realized that yours little creation is hungry, so we fed it more. It certainly performs an exchange. The activity is intriguing after it feasts. I've been able to follow Yaniv's degradation with a more analytical mind than when we lost Caro. I have to say, the process is so elegant. The science involved almost seems poetic. It may be reproducible. Just imagine how much more I could have learned if the scanners were all active at the time. Project Day 77. Another accidental discharge. But this time, I ensured the scanners were running beforehand. From the audio logs of Warlock and Researcher, Jaina 14, salvaged after evacuation. There are several things to note here. First of all, the artifact that they speak of obviously has to do with the poison element inside of the gauntlets that carry this lore tab. The way Jaina 14 describes it is accurate to the poison and the Destiny mechanics. It stings, then does more damage over time. And with these gauntlets specifically, that poison will spread. It is my interpretation that in the story, the poison takes longer to kill bigger things. It makes sense gameplay-wise and lore-wise. When you poison a boss, is it really going to kill it? And doesn't it take longer to kill yellow or orange bars with poison than it does with red bar enemies, which are considered weaker? Of course it does. And I am now understanding that this is absolutely intentional. When they tested the poison on cattle, the results were so upsetting that they refused to do it again. I am willing to place a bet that says the cattle died such a long and agonizing death, and it was simply too much for the researchers. When Caro gets infected, which is our first discharge in this timeline of events, there are 8 days between Jana 14 documenting the discharge and the Vanguard forbidding a post-mortem analysis. Caro most likely died maybe 1 to 2 days before the Vanguard entry at a minimum, and it is possible he could have taken the full 8 days to die. A human being here took an entire week to finally die from that poison. Something extraordinarily noteworthy is that the artifact in mention, H-349, isn't even the Necrotic grip gauntlets. Rather, they were testing on the Thorn, which was created in darkness by the dredging Yor. This is not speculation, but it is actually made fact by several mentions in this tab. First, the mere mention of fanatics producing knockoffs is a direct reference to the dredging Yor creating Thorn, with his followers recreating this weapon and getting it into more hands, spreading his corruption as if it were poison. Second of all, they thought it was Hive Tech in the very same project day that I just mentioned, but upon discovering that it wasn't, Jaina later mentioned it as, quote, Yor's little creation, end quote. Somewhere along the line, between day 30 and day 65, Jaina came to understand where this weapon originated, and the dredging Yor only ever created the Thorn. He didn't create poisonous gloves. So where do the gloves come from? Well, I'll get there, but the nail in the coffin is in Project Day 45, where Jaina directly compares the artifact to a weapon, where a weapon is, boom, done. This stumped me before I realized that she was talking about the Thorn, because the question arose, why would you compare poisonous gauntlets to a weapon's performance? Wouldn't you be studying the poison itself, and therefore compare it to something else deadly in nature? By day 51, Jaina mentioned that someone called Yaniv has been crying a lot. This is where I speculate more than anywhere else in this video, but there may have been more researchers that died between Caro becoming infected and Yaniv crying. However, it seems that all of the accidental discharges were documented by Jaina, and considering her zeal for this project, it could have just been that the intense pressure and stress with the consequence of death was weighing more on Yaniv each day. We reached the 2 most disturbing bits of the lore tab. Day 65, where Jaina opens up with an accidental discharge, but then mentioned that she was feeding the artifact in order to study it more. And what does she feed the artifact, I can hear you wondering? Poor Yaniv. Somewhere along the line, Jaina, and possibly her researchers, had disassembled the Thorn, and the artifact in mention was the poison-causing mechanism inside of it. She had direct contact to this corruption. 12 days after Yaniv's death and untimely betrayal, one more discharge occurs, and Jaina made sure to keep the scanners running for that one. So what do we make of all of this? There's 3 things. Something I need to point out is that Caro's mind seemed to be corrupted as he died. He kept saying he had been reborn. Jaina noted that he almost seemed happy. Whether or not that speaks to the poison lulling one to death is unsure, but it solidifies our knowledge that it affects more than the physical being. Jaina had the privilege of being an exo, and while this may or may not have had something to do with her not being physically affected by the poison, I am here to tell you that mentally she was. Since the release of Beyond Light, we have learned heaps more about the exos, where they came from, and how unstable and inhumane some of the processes were. There were several exos splayed out over Europa that grant you very dark audio clips of things going wrong, wondering who their mom is, tasting food from memories that should have been wiped. Exos are notorious for being unhinged, and even at the beginning of the tab, Jaina seemingly had some of that instability in her research, even secretly keeping some of Caro's disintegrated cell tissue. The poison further corrupted her mind, causing her to push further with her research as she had increased exposure to the thorn. She started out with being unable to test on animals again, but ended with betraying however many researchers she needed to get the data she wanted. The last bit of the storyline is incredibly easy to overlook if it weren't for the last line. Quote, from the audio logs of Warlock and researcher Jaina 14, salvaged after evacuation, end quote. So what does that mean, and how do we end up with the gauntlets? Let me rephrase the entire story, just so it makes sense. We start with a group of researchers getting their hands on the thorn. Many of them were skeptical of possessing it at all. First, believing it to be hive tech, they tested it out. Once the animal test was conducted on day 5, they refrained from doing anything further destructive with it. It wasn't until day 30 that they found it wasn't hive tech, and on day 31, the thorn accidentally kills a human, taking almost a week to finish them off. While saddened by the first victim's departure, Jaina believed to have gained incredibly valuable information from the corpse of said human, witnessing how the poison worked and affected both his mind and his body. As the poison works its way into Jaina's mind, she begins to see it as something to be admired, as something beautiful, becoming mesmerized by the slow, agonizing death the thorn causes to each one of its victims. The poison works into her mind at a quicker rate, causing Jaina to become more insatiable, slowly killing off her fellow researchers and dissecting their remains. It stops becoming testing and becomes a feeding process to her, giving the mechanism inside the gun what it wants in exchange for the data she had her eyes on. She had an insatiable appetite for the slow destruction of the poison within the thorn, and somewhere along the timeline, she disassembled the gun to have more direct contact with the mechanism. After she killed her final victim in the lore tab with the scanners running, I believe I can safely speculate that from here, she did several things. She took the poison mechanism from the gun and hardwired it into a pair of Warlock gauntlets, which would explain the necrotic grip's rougher look. It is then of my opinion that she wore these gloves and went on a rampage, causing the mentioned evacuation of the facility. While it doesn't directly tell us that she did go on a killing spree, that final line shares many hints, and Destiny lore tends to get dark. It doesn't let up on how far the writing will go. Her audio logs from her research were recovered after an evacuation level incident in the entire facility, as she likely stormed from lab to lab, feeding the poison within her newfound gauntlets with an untold frenzy. Her feeding the mechanism in the lore tab, combined with the likely killing of more people afterwards, is what makes these gauntlets more potent than the thorn itself, as it causes poison to spread, corrupt, and spread. The gauntlets are so strong that they actually provide direct gameplay benefits to all weapons of sorrow. The darkness worked its way into Jaina's mind, using her as a way to feed itself, and to become much more than it had simply been on Project Day 1.